about what's happening in Ukraine and about U.S. Ukrainian and European Ukrainian relations. I'm Angela Stent. I'm director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University, and I'm also a senior non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. Over the past 2 years, Ukraine has made some progress in its integration with Europe. It completed, of course, its association agreement with the European Union. But concerns about democratic backsliding and the selective use of justice in Ukraine have put Kyiv's relations, to quote one of our top officials, on hold, certainly with the United States. So we have with us the leaders of the 4 task force from the Ukraine 2020 Policy Dialogue. Now, this was organized by the U.S. Ukraine Foundation and supported by the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv. Its goal was to bring together 4 task force composed of American and Ukrainian experts to address issues important to Ukraine's stability and its integration into Europe. The task forces addressed foreign policy, national security and defense, energy security, and culture and education. It met a number of times since its formation, the 4 task force in the spring, including a larger meeting in June in Kyiv with our Ukrainian colleagues. So today marks the release of this report, consisting of the 4 task force reports, and you can find them outside. I know they're on the table outside, with recommendations for both the Ukrainian and U.S. governments. And these reports have now been submitted both to the U.S. government and to the Ukrainian government. So our panel today consists of 4 of the U.S. co-chairs, and besides Ed Chow, Bill Miller, Bob Nurick, and Steve Pifer, Marta Farion co-chaired the Education and Culture Task Force, Keith Smith co-chaired the Energy Security Task Force, James Green co-directed the project, along with Ola Shamshur, the former Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, who I'm sure all of you know and who was very much a participant in this process. So I will just introduce to you the panelists very briefly. They're all very distinguished in the order in which they will speak. They will give short presentations, and then I hope we have a lively question and answer. Our first speaker will be Ambassador William Miller. He, of course, was a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, and he's now a senior public policy fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Our second panelist will be Edward Chow, who's a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and of course has worked many years in the energy sector. Our third speaker will be Stephen Pifer, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, also former United States ambassador to Ukraine. And our fourth speaker will be Robert Nurick, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. So please, Bill.
I've been asked to speak first to talk about the state of culture and education and the characteristics that we find today of national identity. Without question, there is a cleavage in political culture between the people and the government. This is creating profound difficulties throughout Ukraine, particularly those who had aspirations for a democratic Ukraine. 3 generations are primarily affected. First is the Soviet generation, those who were brought up in the Soviet time, served in Soviet government in many respects, in the military, in the Great Patriotic War, and their attitudes and cultural values were in part shaped by the Soviet experience. The second generation is the transition. Those who were born in the Soviet period but grew up in the in the present Ukraine post-1991. And they are the people who are involved in governance now. They are the mainsprings of business and enterprise, and they are the ones who are performing on the stages of the opera houses. They are the ones who are writing novels and poetry and painting. Then there's the younger generation, some of whom are here today with us as interns and beginning their professional lives. They are post-Soviet, and they were born after independence, and they are the hope of the future. In 1996, the cultural values of Ukraine were defined legally in the form of the Constitution. This is a remarkable document. I recommend reading and rereading it because it does express in very clear terms what the values Ukrainians believe in. And if you measure that expression of value against the performance of a government, you find a great disconnect. And this is the crisis that is taking place in Ukraine. The rule of law, which is laid out very carefully in the Constitution, is now abused. The electoral system is bent out of shape, and the economy, by any definition, but I'll take the Aristotelian definition, is an oligarchy. That is, government of the few, for the benefit of the few, not government of the people, by the people, for the people. That's the problem. That's a description of political culture. But what is distinctive about Ukrainian identity is that it is not Russian, it is something else, self-defined, expressed in music, in poetry, in painting, even on the stages of the opera houses of Ukraine. And it's magnificent. It's in great vitality, and it's in the greatest of health. The universities and schools are in great trouble. No school teacher, no professor in a university can live on the salaries that he receives. So this is a failure of government to provide for the education of the children, of their children, and laying the groundwork for the future. The universities are, there have been attempts to control the intellectual freedom of universities, as there has been an attempt to control the freedom of the press. And certainly there is control of TV, the main source of information for most people. However, Ukrainians, as you all know, are a tough, independent, fiercely objective people about their own possibilities, about their own rights. And they are expressing themselves. We have a test coming up in the elections. And of course, as we all know, the leading opposition candidates will not be present because they're in jail. They're in jail because their political opposition Despite this, despite the pressures, I would say that the health of Ukrainian intellectual ability, the integrity of Ukrainianness has been maintained and even strengthened by the test. And this is a test. We are at a crisis point in Ukraine, and the future really will only be decided by to what degree the younger generation will take charge and throw out the scoundrels. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very clear statement. Ed.
Thank you, Angela. First of all, I want to apologize to the audience that I've had a lingering cold, so I'm not in as good voice as usual. I also want to thank the U.S. Ukraine Foundation for this, doing this project, for Nadia McConnell and her staff, Jim, Yulia, Makian, for helping the task force from both Ukraine and the U.S. as well as Europe engage in this very fruitful dialogue. One of the things I noticed in reading the introduction, because I was just sick, I just read it this morning, that I thought was very insightful was the remarkable consensus among the expert community on Ukraine's problems as well as Ukraine's solutions to the problems. And that was certainly true in the case of the Energy Task Force. I won't go into the entire paper. I've talked about Ukraine and Ukraine's energy problems so often in this town. I must be really tiresome by now, including this room, as I recall. But I just highlight a few points, which is not only are Ukraine's energy problems well known, the solutions are also well known and has been around for a long, long time with numerous studies, including studies commissioned by the government itself on what it should do on energy policy. The fact that it hasn't changed is really due to the absence of political will than anything else. In some ways, this government, the current government, which I don't want to pick on because they inherited these problems. They were not the only ones who didn't address Ukraine's energy challenges. In some ways, when they came in, they were the best equipped people to actually make the change if they wanted to. These were experienced people who served during Kuchma's time in very responsible position. They had control of the Rada. So if, unlike the previous crowd, which was too busy perhaps fighting among themselves, including over the energy franchise, to do very much, if they wanted to, they could. But they haven't, and things are only getting worse instead of getting better. You think about it, it's been a 20-year economic transition. That's an awful long time not to do something about the problem when your country has so much room for energy efficiency improvements. Ukraine has an energy intensity that is higher than Russia's. It has so much potential for domestic production increases. So one of the themes that I think is weaved throughout these papers is the need to engage civil society in an informed conversation about various issues, and that's certainly true in the case of energy. It concerns me when energy issues are politicized, particularly as a former commercial negotiator. If you can go to jail for making a bad agreement, that's really scary. And what does that mean for the current government that may have also entered into bad agreements that could be overturned by future governments? A different point is that one of the things that this government has done is that it seemed to be opening itself up for foreign direct investment in the energy sector. And that can be a very good thing. We have had both Chevron and Shell sign or awarded, haven't signed anything yet as far as I know, awarded having won tenders on conventional gas, ExxonMobil and Chow in the offshore. These are wonderful opportunities for a country, for an economy that doesn't have a lot of success stories to talk about in energy. But they can only be productive as well as attract future investment if they're handled properly, if they're handled professionally, that the contracts are negotiated in a proper way, not because of some short-term political expediency, and that not too many things get in the way of world-class companies wanting to operate in Ukraine, whether that is selected local partners who have dubious ability to contribute to the investment, or a minister already guessing at what the price of gas ought to be that will be produced, which just happened a couple of days ago. Access to infrastructure, access to markets. There are lots of issues that can be resolved, should be resolved in a proper way if foreign direct investment is to contribute in a meaningful way. And among the reforms that is probably critical for the Ukrainian gas and electricity sector is pricing reform, which is long delayed. Now, pricing reform is a tough thing to do. We know that from our own experience in the U.S. But if there's never an action plan, if there's never a program that says over a course of 2, 3, 4 years, we're going to take the following steps in order to gradually liberalize prices, then long-term investments cannot take place, either on the production side or on the energy efficiency improvement side of things. So an action plan is necessary, not just a set of aspirations without precise target dates. And here, too, civil society needs to be engaged in their conversation. In a democracy, you cannot sustain economic reform without the support of the people. Privatization can be both a blessing and a curse. If it's done properly, formally inefficient, ineffective, state enterprises can be freed up to do a proper economic function. If it's done on an insider dealing basis, where favored bidders, politically connected bidders, are able to get assets without contributing to increased competition, which is what you want from privatization, then they can be a problem and can further discredit in the public's eye the steps that the government is trying to do on energy generally. There's a huge need to stabilize the energy relationship with Russia. Russia is a natural partner of Ukraine's by geography, if nothing else, on energy. But this can be done, should be done, but needs to be properly prepared. And I'm afraid that I've seen too many times where Ukrainian governments, not just this one, enter into negotiations with Russia without being properly prepared and taking short-term steps they will live to regret later. And I'm not sure that we aren't setting ourselves up for a similar situation this winter. Russians seem quite determined to build South Stream as a bypass gas pipeline, bypassing Ukraine. I guess I said it in this room first, that it may be the best thing to happen to Ukrainian energy reform, because finally Ukraine will have to not just try to leverage its transit to gain certain privileges from Russian gas, but to take the fundamental reforms necessary to take advantage of the potential that they have domestically. As you can see, most of these problems and their solutions are domestic. They're internal. There are limits to how much external influence or assistance can be provided to help it along. So one of the things that we recommend to the West and to the American government in particular to do is also to engage more directly with the Ukrainian public, to say the same things to the Ukrainian public which they say to Ukrainian officialdom privately. And to be prepared if and when political will finally appears in Kyiv to do serious energy reform, to be prepared at that moment to engage vigorously. Otherwise, we are all just pretending to do something rather than addressing the serious fundamental problems.
Thank you very much for another very clear statement, Steve.
Well, thanks, Angela. Let me also thank the U.S. Ukraine Foundation for organizing this and the American Embassy in Kyiv for supporting it. I co-chaired the task force on foreign policy with Valery Chow of the Razumkov Center, and the task force paper there on foreign policy reflects a consensus among American and Ukrainian participants, both as to the situation that Ukrainian foreign policy faces when it looks at Europe, the United States, and Russia, but also on the recommendations that were transmitted to the American and Ukrainian governments. And the task force agreed early on that Ukraine faces a challenge. On the one hand, it has to find the right balance between its relationship with the West and its relationship with Russia, while at the same time pursuing integration into political and economic institutions in Europe, particularly the European Union. And over the past 2 years for Ukraine, it appears that Ukraine's freedom for maneuver in this space has become progressively narrowed. And that results primarily from the democratic problems that have already been mentioned, the democratic regression within Ukraine, the selective application of justice against people like Yulia Tymoshenko and Yuri Lutsenko. And the result has been is that Ukraine's relations with Europe and the United States are on hold. They become frozen at a time when you see Russia pursuing a more active policy towards Ukraine that's aimed at two goals. One, increasing Russian influence within Ukraine, but also at drawing Ukraine into the integration projects that Russia is trying to promote in the pro-Soviet space, such as the Eurasia Union, such as the Collective Security Treaty Organization. So it seemed to us that Ukraine has a choice to make. But we saw this less as a geopolitical choice and more as a choice by Ukrainians about values, about the nature of the Ukrainian economy, and about the relationship between the state and the citizen. And so we came out with three broad recommendations. First of all, it seemed to us, both on the American and the Ukrainian side, that the best course for Ukraine is to adhere to the path it's defined for integration into the European Union. Second, Ukraine needs to take part in the association agreement, a key element of which is the deep and comprehensive free trade arrangement, and make that the precondition for how Ukraine decides to pursue arrangements with economic and trade unions to its east. Because if Ukraine doesn't get that right, it could preclude the free trade agreement with the European Union from coming into effect, and basically it could isolate itself from the richest trading bloc in the world. And then third, it's important that Ukraine come up with clear expectations with regards to how it plans to interact with institutions such as the Customs Union, such as the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Now, we then took the three directions: Europe, the United States, and Russia, and we broke our Europe recommendations down into three areas. First was the Ukrainian relationship with the European Union. And the challenge here for the government of Ukraine is basically to unfreeze that relationship, which has basically been on hold for the past year due to the demographic issues. And it's going to turn first and foremost on Kyiv's recognition of these problems and its ability to begin to address internal problems that demonstrates in a convincing way that Ukraine is moving back towards EU democratic values. Part of this is Ukraine needs to move forward and bring the association agreement into force, but that's not going to happen. And I think European government's been very clear that will not happen unless Ukraine first moves on democracy internally. And then the third recommendation was that Ukraine ought to move to reinvigorate those institutions in Kyiv that are responsible for coordinating an active Ukrainian policy of integration into the European Union. In terms of what the United States government can do, I think the U.S. government has been clear that it sees integration into the European Union as the right course for Ukraine, and the U.S. government ought to be thinking about ways it can use American technical assistance to facilitate that integration path, to facilitate Ukraine's move to adoption of both EU democratic and market values. In terms of Ukraine's relationship with NATO, it's fairly clear that Ukraine doesn't want membership, but that should not preclude Ukraine from building on its annual programs of cooperation to deepen partnership relations with NATO. And here the United States can provide advice in terms of how you build that practical cooperation and also serve as a friend of court in Brussels. There's a third element of, I think, Ukraine's Europe policy, which is in 2013, Ukraine will hold the chair for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And that's an opportunity for Ukraine. I think the view within the task force was it will be important that Ukraine not overreach and not try to do too many things. If you try to do too many things with your chairmanship, you will do nothing well. So as it looks towards 2013, the Ukrainian government should be thinking, what would be the priorities? And to our group, a logical priority was Transnistria, and to see if promotion of that dispute, there could be progress in that score. Of course, OSCE is deeply involved, and that's an issue that borders on Ukraine. A second area might be the arms control area. Can Ukraine, which has made some contributions both on the arms control and the non-proliferation areas in the last 20 years, can it do some things to facilitate the frozen situation around conventional arms control in Europe? Turning to the Ukraine's relationship with the United States, there's a very broad agenda between Washington and Kyiv, but as with Europe, the pace of that engagement, particularly at the high level, is lagging. And I would just say that a photo opportunity with the president in a receiving line at the UN General Assembly is not a meeting, so there's no confusion on that point. And I don't think that's going to change at the high level unless Ukraine addresses the democratic issues that are also problematic in Kyiv's relationship with Europe. Now, beyond that, I think Ukraine can work to do some things to facilitate relations with the West and the United States. It can improve the business climate. It can try to broaden trade relations. And the U.S. government has an interest in helping out in those areas. But at the high level, I don't think there's going to be a lot of progress in terms of the sorts of high-level engagement that Bill and I saw during the 1990s. You're not going to get back to that unless Kyiv comes to, I think, a different course on its democratic issues. And finally, Ukraine's relationship with Russia. In 2010, Ukraine made a number of significant concessions to Moscow, but it doesn't seem that those yielded much. They yielded a discount on gas price, and the value of that has been eroded by the fact that the price of gas has increased significantly in the past 2 years. And you see in Russia, I think, a fairly active effort to try to engage Ukraine in the sorts of integration projects that Russia is leading. The Customs Union, the Eurasia Union, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And it would be prudent for the leadership in Ukraine to expect those efforts to continue and intensify. Now, for Ukraine to protect its position, I think it has to do a couple of things. One is fix its relationship with the West, but also as it engages with its neighbors to the east, engage on a bilateral basis as opposed to engaging with those institutions, which could have the result of intertwining Ukraine into regional organizations that hinder its effort to draw closer to the European Union. And then just a second point that Ed's addressed, the normalization of the gas relationship with Russia is really fundamental to Ukraine's ability to manage its relationship with that country. In terms of the U.S. government, I think the sense was the U.S. government needs to tread lightly on this issue. It should be transparent with both Moscow and Kyiv about how it is engaging the other. But this is an issue primarily between those two capitals. So I would just close by, the sense of the group was that because of the domestic issues in Ukraine, Ukraine is now in a difficult position in its relationships with both Europe and the United States. And if that cannot be fixed, I think Ukraine increasingly is going to find that it has a difficult relationship and a more challenging relationship with Russia. And to the resolution of this, the democratic issues within Ukraine are going to be central.
Thank you very much, Steve. Bob.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would also like to add my vote of thanks to the foundation and to our embassy, but also to my colleagues on the task force, both American and Ukrainian, for the time and efforts that they've put into this. Let me begin by saying, though, a few words about why we thought it was important to look at this question of Ukraine's security policy, and in particular the prospects for and challenges to U.S. and European engagement with Ukraine in this area. Essentially, there are three basic reasons, I think. The first is some shared interests, some common interests. There's some shared concerns about security issues that we and they face, both regional and global. And in light of the potential impact of Ukraine's security situation on stability in Europe in general, there is, I think, it's fair to say, a strong interest here in supporting a more coherent and constructive Ukrainian security policy. Secondly, a second reason is that cooperation has now been going on for some 20 years, and in some areas it's been quite useful. It is, in some areas, has produced some results and engagement by Ukraine that have been appreciated in the West, and I'll say a few words more about this later. And this is backed up by the fact that there is a very capable security policy community in Ukraine, which remains committed to these activities and to engagement in general. So that's the second reason. The third reason, though, is that this engagement is under pressure. It's under pressure in part for reasons that have nothing in particular to do nothing in particular to do with Ukraine as such, especially the problems with the declining defense budgets and the implications that will have for funding for programs of cooperation, but also importantly for reasons that do have to do with Ukraine, both some aspects of its defense policy and engagements that are troublesome to the West, and in particular, as we've heard in other areas, concerns about domestic trends. Concerns which inevitably will have begun to, and I think will continue to, reduce political support in the Congress and elsewhere for funding for these activities. So let me elaborate a little bit on these points as I go through some of the main items that I think emerged from the deliberations of our task force. And one of the main themes that you'll see that emerges and is discussed in the paper is similar to what we've heard from some of the others about concerns about the extent of commitment at the highest levels of the Ukrainian government to these activities. The broad policy context for Ukraine has been set out in the National Security Strategy, which was just released in June, along with an accompanying military document on military strategy. And these documents lay out describe a very difficult security environment for Ukraine, and lament the extent to which Ukraine lacks reliable security guarantees, is feeling more and more isolated from broader European processes, security policy processes, and talks about the danger of being relegated to what it calls a gray zone of security. All this makes a great deal of sense. One would think that there would be a particular emphasis, therefore, given this view of its security situation, a particular emphasis in re-energizing these security relationships abroad with Europe and the United States. And indeed, on paper at least, there's a commitment to do so. As I'm sure you all know, Ukraine under the Yanukovych administration has explicitly dropped its desire to join NATO and has adopted so-called non-bloc status, but also says in its policy papers that it is committed to continuing and indeed deepening engagement with the U.S. and NATO in areas of mutual interest. The problem is it's very hard to see, not only in the document, but in the daily interactions of governments, where its real priorities lie, how committed it really is to these kinds of engagement, where it thinks that engagement can help, and therefore where it's willing to commit real political capital and economic resources to sustaining these arrangements. And I'll elaborate on these points in a couple of areas, if I could. One has to do with, again, with Ukraine's engagements, international engagements. As I mentioned before, there are areas in which this has been very productive, and they continue. Ukraine has been engaged in Kosovo. It is assigned medical personnel and transport aircraft to support ISAF in Afghanistan. It's been involved in Operation Active Endeavor in the Mediterranean. It's very much increasingly involved in anti-piracy, multilateral anti-piracy activities, and is continuing to be involved in some space launch activities. So there's a body of work there. But it's not so clear what it envisions in the future, what kinds of operations it thinks are important, and with whom. And this matters because the absence of clarity on this makes it hard both for officials inside Ukraine and inside the defense ministries to know where their attention should most and priorities should lie, and hard for its international partners, the U.S. and NATO, to know where, at a time of declining budgets and other concerns, it's most important to engage. So it's quite easy if you talk to governments, government officials, or to non-government analysts like us up here. It's not at all hard to get people to articulate why these engagements, why cooperation is important. What's harder and becoming more difficult is to articulate why, given the pressures on defense budget, given all the other priorities, given the uncertainties about what happened, what the results of some of the cooperation has been in the past, why it's important to continue to commit real capital and resources to these activities. I think there's a case, as I say, for doing it, but the politics of this are not propitious at the moment. What does this mean? It means, among other things, that it would be very helpful if the Ukrainian administration would start to articulate, not just on paper, but in terms of real policy interactions with its own officials, where its priorities lie, why it cares about this, and what it wants to achieve. It's also going to need to make clear how these relationships will proceed in light of the other aspects of Ukraine's dealings with the West, particularly on some of these domestic policy issues. Now, in terms of U.S. engagement in particular, again, this is an area where there's been quite a lot of work over the years, but it's become, and some of it has been quite useful. But in some cases, again, the U.S. officials, I think, are simply uncertain about how much the current administration in Kyiv is really committed to these activities. It talks the talk. It's not clear that it's walking the walk as yet. And again, I think it's my own sense is that the government here and governments in Europe want to continue and will, but there's going to be much greater premium when they look at the activities that they've undertaken in the past and are considering in the future, a much greater premium on making sure that they show real results, demonstrable results. Cooperation and engagement for its own sake is going to be harder to sustain. Now, the final area that I'll mention has, and you'll see discussed in the paper, has to do with cooperation in defense industry. Our Ukrainian colleagues made it very clear that this is a very high priority for Ukraine in general, both for the policy community and certainly for the administration there. And there's some hope there that there would be interest in the West. They argue that they have some capabilities which ought to be of interest to Western companies, that manufacturing costs are low, that in some cases they have access to markets which we don't, and so The fact of the matter is there's not much interest, unfortunately, among Western companies at the moment. And it's in part because, again, at a time when their own budget, when they see their own budgets declining, they're going to be focusing primarily on areas where the prospects are established and budgets are high, and those are not primarily in Ukraine, but in other parts of the world. But also for political reasons. They don't, given the lack of economic incentives, what they will look for is support from governments. In this case, it's not clear that this is going to be a high priority for the U.S. as well. So we've been looking here at what might be done in light of these challenges. And essentially, the real question is whether there are additional niche capabilities in Ukraine that can be exploited. As I mentioned before, there are areas already where cooperation takes place. The question is there more? And what we've recommended is essentially a further, much closer and systematic look at what the possibilities might be, both at the policy level and at the industry level. At the policy level, it's going to need to clarify what the real political support will be among governments for sustaining cooperation in this area, where it's useful, where there are uncertainties or challenges, how to deal with objections from third countries, meaning this euphemism meaning Russia in particular, how to address problems of corruption in this sector in Ukraine, how to deal with the fact that some of Ukraine's arms sales are to customers that are widely viewed as unsavory in U.S. and European capitals, and the like. These are all things that need to be talked about clearly and systematically to see just simply where the political support will lie and in what areas. And secondly, at the industrial level, there are a number of things that can be done. And in particular, the idea should be to try to specify more concretely what areas of technology in particular would be of interest for both sides. Again, as I say, it's a question of identifying niche capabilities. A number of areas have already been suggested for further examination, including space launch, cyber, border security technologies, and so on. There may be also utility in looking for ways to transfer lessons learned from U.S. industry to deal with two new problems for Ukraine in this area, namely how to privatize and how to outsource some of these activities to make this the industrial complex in Ukraine leaner without sacrificing the capabilities it needs. So where did this lead us? Just a couple of observations at the very end, some common themes, which are very similar to ones that you've heard from the others. One is that there's very little dispute among our Ukrainian colleagues about what the problems are and what needs to be done. Another is that at the end of the day, the key problems are primarily internal. Questions about will, direction, in some cases, capacities at the highest levels of the government. It's not a problem at the level of ministries and offices, but above that. And for those reasons, therefore, the need to engage not only governments, but also the broader policy community and the public, in part to try to sustain the things that are useful and that are politically supportable. But also to preserve a level of engagement which will set the stage which can sustain cooperation sufficiently to allow for a more robust engagement when political circumstances get better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As you can see, this report makes rather sobering reading. Each of the four task forces, I think, has diagnosed very well the problem, and they've also made suggestions about how to tackle it. And let me just ask all of you a brief question, and then we'll throw it over to the audience. You all talked about a number of different solutions. where would you start? What would be your first policy focus if you were trying to remedy some of the problems that you have all identified and of which your Ukrainian colleagues were very aware? We'll start with you, Bill Mellon.
I think all of the polling and interviews that have been undertaken in the last several years among different levels and groups in Ukrainian society all have as number one getting rid of corruption and corrupt officials. I would start there.
Thank you. Ed, anything to add to that?
What made you think of energy and corruption? I'm not sure that the two things I'm going to mention are the most important thing to do, but the most urgent items to be attended to. And one I already alluded to, which is stabilizing the gas relationship with Russia. I think we're setting ourselves up, well, we have the potential of a gas crisis this winter. Ukraine has failed to commit to buy the gas that is contractually committed to buy. This is a looming liability of billions of dollars. They can say that Russia can take them to arbitration in Stockholm if they like, but nevertheless, these are real contracts that this government signed that they're failing to meet their obligation on. And this is a card that Russia can play whenever it suits it. And it usually finds it more suitable in the wintertime than summertime for some reason. We're almost overdue, right? 2006 gas crisis, 2009 gas crisis. The problem hasn't gone away, so the potential for a crisis still remains. Ukraine is injecting less into gas storage this summer than is normally the case to prepare for winter. This may be okay because the gas flows are also lower. Because Russia has been diverting volumes to Yamal and to Nord Stream. But it is something that's worrisome in my mind in terms of preparation for the winter. The other urgent issue is the perennial, right, pricing reform. And we had one price increase every time you need an agreement with the IMF. You agree on a program, and then you renege on it. This really needs to be well thought out, planned, designed, and communicated to the public as to why it's necessary, why is this for the long-term good of the Ukrainian economy. Which is why the absence of energy policy debate, discussion during the Rada election is so dismaying to me. How do you address tough issues if you never talk about it during an election campaign? So those would be the two items that I would address.
Thank you. Steve?
I would emphasize the importance of doing something to reverse the current reversal of democracy progress within Ukraine. Because that is, I think, the single biggest problem that Ukraine has in both its relationships with the European Union and with the United States. It has really frozen high-level engagement over the last year. For those members of the European Union who are not enthusiastic about a more expanding European Union, Ukraine's regression on democratic values is the perfect excuse for them to argue that the EU should turn down its relationship with Ukraine. And it goes back to about 2 weeks ago, I was at a conference at the Yalta European Strategy Conference in Yalta. And I think it was Bob Zellick who was a speaker there. He posed the question. He said, Ukraine needs to make a decision. Is it going to be the next Poland or the next Belarus? And unfortunately for Ukraine, I think the course it's on now is leading many to conclude it's headed towards becoming Belarus. And that's not a good image for Ukraine, and that's not a good image that's going to help promote stronger Western engagement with Ukraine.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bob.
I think I also, I would stress at the outset the same point that Steve made, because given the pressures on these relationships, the concerns about domestic trends in Ukraine, as I mentioned before, is the problem that surrounds all the debates about what makes sense to do in these areas, and not in the abstract, not what makes sense in the abstract, but where it's worth Western governments committing resources and time and attention. So I think that as a contextual factor, it's critical. But in this area in particular, I think I would focus on two areas. Again, not because they're necessarily the most important over the long run, but they are, I think, most important in the near term to sustain cooperation for the foreseeable future. And one of those is the first of those is a combination of work on clarifying where and how Ukraine can continue usefully to engage in Western security operations, because this is with the end of Ukraine's drive towards NATO membership, this and security sector reform are the two basic rationales in the West for sustaining cooperation. They were also the rationales through the 90s, so we've returned to that to that situation. And it's important, therefore, to develop those, in part to remind ourselves that we still have an interest in this. This is an enduring interest that transcends political vicissitudes, at least to some degree. And the second area is, despite all the difficulties with it, is to start looking hard at possibilities at defense industrial cooperation. For the opposite reason, namely that it's going to be important really to try to engage serious Ukrainian administration interest. And we've been persuaded, I think, by our Ukrainian colleagues that that serious attention to this, however difficult it may be, is probably the first area that can, as I say, that can really get the attention of higher level authorities in Kyiv.
Thank you. The floor is now open for questions. Please identify yourself and say to whom your question is directed. We'll start in the back there.
Andriy Masyuk, I still teach at Kyiv Hill Academy. This is primarily to Ambassador Miller, but to all panelists. Ambassador Miller, you painted a picture of Ukraine as an oligarchy. How would you engage an oligarchy? How would you engage a society that's built on political and economic patronage? How do you engage a society that the most frequent question when I work in Ukraine is, "A komu это надо?" How do you really build those engagements? Thank you.
You go right to the heart of the difficulty. Ukraine, I need not remind you and others here, emerged from a communist Soviet socialist system in which all property belonged to the state. And now, and there was no significant individual wealth. And now you have wealth accumulation as a major phenomenon in the country. Where does the wealth come from? Some of it, of course, comes from new initiatives, certainly in the IT area. Ukraine's brilliance in the world has been demonstrated. But where did the wealth come from that the oligarchs possess? They came from the assets of the state. So wealth distribution, the distribution of wealth to the people has been skewed. And your students know this, and I'm sure you teach them this phenomenon. What to do about it? So it's the question that I found when I first came to Ukraine in 1993. The great argument was, what kind of state shall we have? Shall it be like the United States with a free market economy, or shall it be like the Nordics with a proportional mix of state and private sectors? To what degree do we take care of the aged, the less fortunate? What is the state of our health system? What is the state of our education system? And you know directly as a professor what the state of education is. You're under great pressure economically and politically to do your work. Kyiv Mohyla is an exception that it has had great leadership and emerged as a premier academic institution. And I know from visits to village schools that the teachers who earn $800 a month, or the equivalent, need at least twice that to live. What do? They paint the school, they sell their vegetables which they grow in the gardens, and still teach because they believe in what they're doing and the necessity to train the youth of the future. Big issue before Ukraine, political as well as economic, is land distribution. The Minister of Agriculture has said that government land, as though the government was the owner of the land, not the people, will be leased for 50 years to China, Saudi Arabia, perhaps Americans. This is a profound question of ownership, of property, of the rule of law, of national values. The pressures on education are symptomatic. And if education is not given a priority, then the future is dismal. The future is with our children, your children.
Thank you. Over here. Just wait for the mic.
Natalia Lakiza-Sachuk, Eurasia Business Consultancy President. First of all, my one comment to the distinguished panel. I could not imagine that in 15-20 minutes you could cover and give comprehensive analysis to so important for Ukraine issues and situations, and even gave solutions, some solutions. My question is to the whole panel. In each of your topics, fields, how can you evaluate, what grade could you give Ukraine, talking about possibilities and their realization at this moment?
Report cards. We'll start with you, Bob.
Well, I would give, that's a good question. Given the grade inflation I see in universities these days. No, I think I'd want to give two different grades. One grade to the people in the ministries who are doing this day to day, and I'd give them quite a high grade because they're very capable people there. They're committed to this. Things get done. I would give a much lower grade to levels above them. As I mentioned, that's where a lot of the problem is. Part of it is simply a lack of political will. Part of it is the lack of political direction. Part of it is the lack of a coherent internal decision-making process in Ukraine, which can sort out, which can establish priorities and provide guidance. So I don't know what letters, but I'd give a pretty high grade to a lot of the day-to-day interactions and people who are responsible at that level, and a lower grade to the part of the system that's above them.
Steve, do you have anything to add?
Well, I'll just grade the leadership. I think Bob's point's well taken. Is there are good, smart, professional people, but it's very hard for them to pursue a policy when that policy is set at the top. And I think if you look at the foreign policy that's been pursued by the Yanukovych government over the last 2 years, and this is a policy that's set by the president in Bankova, it merits a very low grade. And I would give it a low grade because I go back to a conversation that started back in 1994, I think, when Boris Tarasuk, then a deputy foreign minister, met with Deputy Secretary Talbot and said, you know, as the United States envisages a NATO enlargement, and the Russians are unhappy, what's your vision for Ukraine? We don't want to be in a gray zone. And Deputy Secretary Talbot, also the president of this institution, made the observation, he says, we don't have an answer now, but we need to have an answer to that question. And I think over the next couple of years, we developed an answer, and it was an answer in a strategic partnership with the United States. It was an answer developing a distinctive partnership between NATO and Ukraine to make Ukraine feel connected in ways that would not leave it in that gray zone insecurity. What I think has happened over the last 2 years is, with the freezing of the relationship with the West, is the Yanukovych foreign policy has put Ukraine precisely in the gray zone that, you know, the previous 18 years of Ukrainian foreign policy were designed to avoid. And it's very hard to give that kind of outcome a passing grade.
Ed?
Even with grade inflation. You put me in a difficult position as a sometime teacher. And I would say that if I had Ukrainian energy policy makers as students, I would right now give them a C- or a D+. And I assume the student would be asking for incomplete at this point.
Thanks. Anything to add?
Well, I think you know what grade I would give to governments. However, I would give very high marks to the younger generation and the emergence of civil society. And here's where the hope of the future lies, to pull Ukraine out of the depths that it has fallen to.
Thank you. Questions, comments? Yes, young lady back there.
Hello, my name is Katerina Pishikova. I'm a transatlantic fellow at the Transatlantic Academy, which is a research institution based at the German Marshall Fund, just a few blocks away from here. And I'm originally Ukrainian, so let me start by expressing my deep-felt thanks to the work you've done and your respective task forces. And I think the amazing added value of your report is obviously the sort of cross-cutting nature of your recommendations. The fact that you have this cross-sectoral view and sort of link different specific challenges with what could be done on a more strategic level. Having said that, I have, let's hope the governments, the respective governments would listen, of course. Having said that, I have two specific questions. One to Mr. Chow about the possible energy policy solutions. I'm thinking about the recent open letter that Prime Minister Azarov has written to a German newspaper, urging, or let's say reminding the European Union that there was this idea of having a trilateral solution to running gas consortium in Ukraine. Yeah. And I wonder, you know, what is your comment on that? Do you think that's one of the solutions that are still to be pursued, or? And then I have another question to Ambassador Williams Miller. Sorry, Miller. I obviously I belong to what you've identified as a post-Soviet, as a transition generation of Ukrainians. And I think what was amazing in the 1990s was the kind of effort that many different American organizations have taken in promoting civic education. So, you know, working in very broad terms on educating young citizens on what it means to be a citizen in a democratic society. And I'm just curious how you think this plays out now with the new, what you define as a post-Soviet generation. Thank you.
Thank you. Ed. trilateral EU.
I'm
Ukraine.
not aware of Mr. Azarov's open letter, so I can't address the specifics of what that's in the letter. But this is an old idea. It's an idea that was around during Kuchma's time.
U.S. government advanced it in 2000.
And so Steve has scars to show for it. At that time, Western companies took it quite seriously. Remember raw gas, now Eon, did a lot of work on this. Shell also proposed themselves as a party to a three-way agreement. So it's been around for a long time. I went to Essen a few years ago to ask the raw gas people whether they would still consider it or not. And their